Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2700 on the nose with our friend Dan McCarthy, whom you have missed dearly, no doubt, with his absence from the Tom Woods Show, which is entirely my fault. But Dan, as you know, is vice president for publications at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He has many other things that we could say about him, including his work as editor of Modern Age, which is a tremendously important, significant journal of conservative thought that's been around for quite a long time, since the 1950s. But you also know him from his Syndicated column, and I'm always edified, let's say, by Dan's columns. I catch them in the New York Post, and it just brings a smile to my face to see Dan McCarthy in the New York Post, which I used to read regularly as a young man, in the same way that when I saw my friend Tim Carney appear on the McLaughlin Group, I remember thinking, I used to love the McLaughlin Group, and it's great to see all my friends having all these great accomplishments. So, Dan, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Delighted to be here.
All right. Well, look, this is the week of Columbus Day. And I believe the president made some kind of an announcement to the effect that it was to be known as Columbus Day. Now, somebody sent me an email, I think it was from Fidelity, because some of these companies were sending out emails to investors to let them know that it's a bank holiday, but the markets are still open, so you can trade and do whatever. And they specifically went out of their way to say that on this Indigenous Peoples Day, you should remember that the markets are open. And I thought, well, I don't know. I thought the president had a little something to say about that. Well, it turns out that Dan McCarthy had a little something to say about this, not that email in particular, but you indeed had a New York Post column on the subject of Columbus Day. And I think back to the old days when I was in college, and we used to argue about this with people. And we used to try to dig up as many facts as we could about Christopher Columbus and what did or didn't happen, or what he was directly responsible for, or what he wasn't, or things nobody could have known, like all kinds. You dig this up because you felt like you were dealing with people of goodwill on the other side. That if we just throw the evidence available to us on the table, maybe we can come closer to each other in some way. And now I don't get that sense at all. I get the sense that, as Tony Soprano said, in this household, Christopher Columbus is a hero. End of story.
Yeah, I entirely agree. So, my column argues that the Columbus Day arguments are not really about Christopher Columbus. They're about whether or not Western civilization should have expanded into the Americas at all. And clearly on the left, there are an enormous number of activists who say that, it's not that Christopher Columbus has, various skeletons in his closet. It's not that there were accusations against him, when he was governor of Hispaniola. It's not that, he was involved in some degree of slavery and brought over some Indians in conditions of slavery. No, all of those details are secondary. The primary question, the reason we have a Columbus Day in the first place, and the reason why there is opposition to Columbus Day, is because Christopher Columbus brought the Americas into Western civilization. He brought Christianity to the New World. He also brought, the civilization itself, the possibility of commerce, communication, and integration between the Americas and Europe. And in fact, not just Europe, but actually it's because of Christopher Columbus's discovery, and we should honor it as a discovery, that the entirety of the old world becomes connected with the Americas. So even, I make this point in a couple of talks I've given on college campuses recently. Even if you're an American of East Asian or South Asian descent, if you're here voluntarily, it's because Christopher Columbus discovered a land that you or your ancestors now could come to, which they didn't know about before. So not just European Americans, but Asian Americans also owe this tremendous debt. They owe their very existence to Christopher Columbus. And then, of course, with African Americans, it is a morally more complicated story because many Africans came to America, of course, in chains. They were slaves. But, Ward Connerly, the great conservative former regent of the University of California, he always made the case that, he was still ultimately grateful that he was an American, that he was born in America and not in Africa. So despite the injustices that his ancestors had suffered, he was still grateful that he was able to be an American. And so even he, would be very thankful that Christopher Columbus made the discovery that he made. So it's a question, first of all, of whether or not we want to honor the fact that certainly the United States, but the Americas as a whole, are part of Western civilization. Not just, by the way, Western civilization in a kind of parochial sense, but keep in mind all of the streams of universal thought that were able to come to the Americas thanks to Christopher Columbus. So certainly, we've already mentioned Christianity, but monotheism itself, even if you're Jewish, even if you're Muslim, the fact that there is the presence of these religions and a respect for monotheism in the Americas is largely a legacy of Christopher Columbus. Even if you reject Christianity and monotheism as a whole, even if you think of yourself as a secular Enlightenment believer in universal human rights, those universal human rights are also a product of Western civilization. They're also in the Americas because ultimately they were brought by people who followed in the footsteps of Christopher Columbus. And then finally, I make the case, to college students who might reject the Enlightenment as well as monotheism and Christianity. So these are the really radical students who say, you know what, we think Immanuel Kant and the entire legacy of Western philosophy is also oppressive. We think that human rights are, a complete illusion. All there is a damage to the indigenous peoples. So we reject all of that as well. I make the case, look, even if you are the most radical possible student activist on the left, rejects the Enlightenment as well as Christianity, you still are part of a world that was made by Christopher Columbus, because even these radicals are using the technology that ultimately follows in the footsteps of Christopher Columbus to make their own case against Western civilization, against the Enlightenment, against Christianity, against America, and against Christopher Columbus. They too, because of the technology that they can't afford to reject, are part of Christopher Columbus's legacy. And so we are all, in a sense, children of Christopher Columbus. We all owe him the kind of debt that we owe to our parents and our forefathers, who, again, they're imperfect. Columbus Day is not a saint's day, but it's a day that honors someone who is basically a founder of our civilization in this hemisphere, just as much as George Washington is a founder of our republic.
Well, you said something in there that I want to expand on, because I think in a way, even the critics of Columbus don't realize just how much they themselves are indebted to him. And I would say that the very fact that they are able, that they inhabit a moral universe in which the idea has triumphed that there is a certain standard of justice that applies to all peoples, European and non-European alike, and that if a nation or a person or a group were to violate the rights that are shared by us all, that would be morally wrong, and we should criticize even our own people, because we should hold our own people up to a universal standard. That's a European idea. So they're using European moral tools to render their judgment on Columbus. And we can see in the universities, particularly the University of Salamanca, there are numerous theologians who were highly critical of Spain and thought that Spain ought to have known better and behaved better in the New World. And why should they have behaved better? Because these people are human beings just like us. And therefore, they have the rights to property. They have the right not to be expropriated. They have every right that the rest of us have. Now, that is not... Now, let's imagine if the shoe were on the other foot and the peoples of the Americas had possessed the technological and navigational wherewithal themselves to discover, quote unquote, Europe. Is there any reason to think that they would have then behaved the way Antifa thinks that that peoples ought to have behaved? I don't think they're coming to Europe equipped with even the ability to look at themselves and say, we are no better than any other people. We are in the eyes of God the same as all other peoples, and therefore we ought to hold ourselves to the same standards. I just don't see where that would have been coming from. So I don't think it would have been nothing but sunshine and lollipops had the situation been reversed. So I think the Europeans are held to an unreasonable standard here. But the point is, the very fact that they are held to a standard indicates the significance of the Columbian exchange, of the arrival of Columbus. That very fact indicates how significant all of it is. So in other words, even if you criticize Columbus, you're still indebted to him.
Yeah, that's basically right. And, I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of all of the belief systems of pre-Columbian, North America and South America. So perhaps there were tribes who had something of a universalistic outlook. But certainly, the people who make arguments against Christopher Columbus are often making extremely radical relativistic arguments, which they're naive about just how damaging these arguments are, because they're saying, well, look, every people has its story. No two peoples can have a single story. Indigenous peoples are they're kind of it's like there are a cultural and psychological and even metaphysical walls between them and other peoples, and that this is a good thing, that we should have these fragmented different standards among different peoples. And of course, the standards in the Americas when Columbus arrived included things, first of all, the evils that were endemic to Europe in Columbus's time were also endemic to the Americas. So I recently debated a retired professor who seems to have membership in an Indian tribe here in North America. And, he was a retired guy, easygoing, seemed personally likable. But it was ironic to hear him, kind of make these very poor arguments that are just standard left-wing relativism. And, he would say, well, Columbus was involved, to some degree with European slavery. And I said, well, look, I mean, there was slavery in the New World in the Americas long before Christopher Columbus arrived. What Christopher Columbus did not bring, what the Americas had that Europe had long gotten rid of, were the institutions of cannibalism and human sacrifice. And of course, the Caribs in the Caribbean and the Aztecs in Central America, they were still, practicing human sacrifice on a very large scale, or, hanging up human limbs in a meat market, which is what, Columbus's sailors discovered when they went ashore in some of these places. So there were, brutality, unfortunately, is the common currency of humanity. I mean, any civilization you look at is going to have, far enough back in its history, or in some cases even at the end of its history, just enormous abuses of human beings. But what you've pointed out is exactly right. The question is whether you can get beyond those things, whether you can say, you know what, human sacrifice is wrong, cannibalism is wrong, and slavery is wrong. And Western civilization, of course, it has both the philosophical and the religious resources to say these things are wrong, and they're not just wrong for us, they are wrong universally. If you are rejecting those universalisms, you might frame it in a kind of hippie, lovey-dovey, hey, everyone can do their own thing, everyone can have their own standards. But what that means in practice is that some people will have standards that include eating other human beings or murdering children to appease Moloch or some other bloodthirsty god, or slavery itself, or any number of other things. And if that's your standard, if your standard is, every people can have its own completely distinct set of ethics and morality, there are no universal standards. Even if that's your view, there is, however, one universal standard which is not a matter of belief, because it's a matter of practice. And that, of course, is the universal standard of power. And it turns out, that by that universal standard, even if you get rid of the Enlightenment, even if you get rid of Christianity, even if you get rid of Plato, there's still power, which is a unifying and universal fact of human existence. And it was certainly a fact in the Americas that more powerful peoples, like the Aztecs and like the Caribs, they exploited and, in fact, ate and conquered and enslaved the peoples that they encountered. So, you had an even more brutal regime, a more brutal civilization in the Americas, several more brutal civilizations than what Columbus was bringing. It was not the case that you had, this sort of paradise of peace and, respect for other people's cultures. No, you had conquest going on in the Americas, just as you had conquest going on in Europe. The difference being that Europe, in addition to having this universal standard of power, which all peoples everywhere are subject to, Europe also had other kinds of universal standards rooted in philosophy and rooted in Christianity. And that's why we should be proud of being part of Western civilization. It's why Western civilization can be a civilization that, in fact, has a universal dimension. It's not just for Westerners. It really does have something to offer all of humanity. And I think, that's why that's why even critics of Columbus should be very grateful that they are now living in a world, in a hemisphere that Columbus was able to bring into this civilization, which had universal morality and not just the law of universal power.
My dear friends, if you're like me, you've been watching the Fed inflate the dollar into oblivion while politicians bungle trade policy and rack up historic amounts of debt. You're wondering how to protect what you've worked so hard to build. That's why I want to talk to you about Monetary Metals, a company doing something truly revolutionary with gold. We all know gold is a safe haven asset, but let's face it, most gold just sits there in a vault, not doing much. It holds its value over time, but it doesn't grow. What if I told you there's a way to not only own physical gold, but also earn a yield on it, paid in gold every single month? That's exactly what I do with Monetary Metals. I lease my gold with them and earn an annual yield, around 4%, in gold, not in paper currency. I keep my ounces, and every month I get more. Think about it. You still benefit from any price appreciation, like what we've been seeing in 2025 with gold pushing past all-time highs, and you also get paid more ounces of gold along the way. That's what makes this model so exciting. It's a genuine breakthrough. For the first time in decades, gold is functioning as a yield-bearing asset, just like in the classical gold standard days. The Fed can print dollars, they can't print gold. It's time to start growing your wealth in ounces, not just hoping for the best with fiat. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more and see how you can start earning a gold income too. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. Let's switch gears now to more current events. And there's an article over at the American Conservative, which you used to edit, on what's been going on lately with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the representative from Georgia. And apparently Donald Trump himself has asked that very question. Like, what's going on with Marjorie? Apparently he asked people. So she's become, now she's not, I wouldn't say she's consistently critical of the Trump administration. She cheers when things happen that she likes, but she's become critical on some things. And in particular, her messaging on what constitutes America First is a little bit different. I might mention, by the way, Dan, that the other day, Laura Loomer was unhappy about this base that Qatar is apparently building here. And she said, well, what kind of America First is this? And somebody reminded her of what she said 6 months ago, which was America First is whatever Donald Trump says it is. So, live by the sword, die by the sword, I suppose. But anyway, in the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, her concern is that there's a lot of focus on, Venezuela or, everywhere but the U.S. And her complaint is that we still have people struggling with grocery prices. We still have stagnant wages. We still have a lot of these things that we campaigned on and I think authentically believe need to be fixed, but they're not getting fixed and our priorities seem to be all wrong. Do you think there's a constituency for that, or do you think that the Trump brand is so strong that somebody like a Marjorie Taylor Greene trying to go up against it is just hopeless?
No, I do think there's a constituency for that, and you're starting to see, not only a division between those who are, part of, I don't want to say the fan club, but certainly part of, the people who consider themselves to be part of a organized movement with a particular leader, and that leader is Donald Trump, and then the lieutenants of that movement might include people like Laura Loomer. There's that mentality, but then there's also people who are America First, and they believe in the principles or the priorities of America First much more than they believe in being part of an organized, an organization that labels itself America First. Even if it's an informal organization, I think there is such a thing where, you still see yourself as being part of a hierarchy and answerable to the officials of that hierarchy, even if the officials of that hierarchy are interpreting, the principles of the movement in a way that is confusing or seems to be on the face of it completely wrong. I'm not, there's going to be someone taking a clip from this video saying, oh, here's Dan McCarthy calling the Trump movement similar to communism. No, I'm not doing that. But yeah, I think, anyone who's studied, communism knows that you have this tension within the communist movement, especially here in America, back in, the interwar era and then, going forward as well. But, there was always this tension where, communism, if anything, you would think communism is anti-fascist, right? And then, of course, you have the Molotov von Ribbentrop Pact. You have Stalin becoming an ally to Nazi Germany. And, members of the American Communist Party at that time said, wait a minute, we've been taught, ever since we joined the party, that one of our fundamental positions is we are against what the Nazi Germans are doing. And that Nazi Germany is this, hyper-capitalist bourgeois kind of system. Obviously, that's all false. But nevertheless, if you believe that, then you really have to be astonished that, you have this alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the communists were told, look, we have an organization. It is Stalin who decides what the truth is. And if Stalin decides we are now allied with and compatible with Nazism and with the Germans, then you have to obey that. And obviously that led to a certain exodus from the Communist Party. It led some people not to leave, but at least to start harboring doubts, to start asking themselves, where does thinking for myself end? And where does loyalty to the movement, where does that end? And then, of course, the whole thing flips over again because, Hitler then attacks, the Soviets. And so, suddenly the Soviet Union turns around and says, oh, you know what? We're actually allied with the capitalists in America and with the UK against the Nazis. So I mention all of that just because it's a glaring example. It's a really clear example. Trump movement is nothing like communism, but the same sort of dynamics that can happen with any kind of movement can apply here as well, where some people are saying, you know what, I'm in this for a clear set of priorities, a clear set of principles, or a clear overall view that we have to put America first. And other people say, well, you know what, if you're going to have America first, you have to do it in a disciplined way, which means you do need to have some deference to those who are going to set the priorities, even if those priorities look like they're things that don't make sense from the grassroots perspective.
Somebody was saying, it's one of my Facebook friends, and I can't remember who it is, but he was saying that it's a shame that the way our system works is that basically Trump has until 2026 to have some, dramatic, certainly to have the economy booming in a way that everybody perceives as booming. Because you recall under Joe Biden, we had a lot of Trump sympathizers saying this is not a good economy. And the Biden people hectoring them saying, well, look at the charts. Look, are you people just illiterate? Look at how good the economy is. But again, it's the sort of thing where if the economy were really that strong, you wouldn't need to lecture people with charts. They'd perceive that on their own. But anyway, if it isn't humming by the fall of 2026, then back into power come the trans your kids and flood the country with third worlder party. I mean, it's crazy. So of course, in that situation, it doesn't matter what you know about economics. You would say, well, I want the Fed to lower interest rates so that we have a kind of a boom so that doesn't happen. Even though I know that in the long run, this is like trying to nourish myself on energy drinks. I mean, yes, in the short run, I will get a little bit of a stimulus from that. But in the long run, investment has to be funded by saving, and health has to be brought about by legitimate nutrition. But this is the situation that we. I mean, I think what happened was in 2024, because of the, that could have gone either way down to the wire, down to election day. That could have gone either way. And when Trump ended up winning every single swing state, every single one, I think people on the Trump side of things thought we haven't quite vanquished our enemies, but we have really, really disoriented them, and they are down for the count. But the thing about these people is that they're never really down for the count. And what I think some people thought, all right, this is the beginning of the end for I mean, all this talk about the Democrats are in disarray but I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like the position of Trump and the Trump movement and the Republican Party is much more precarious than people I think thought, or maybe it was wishful thinking that it was then. And here we are getting toward the end of 2025. It's another election year somehow already, off-year election year, and it seems like anything could happen. I mean, what do you think about what I just said?
No, I completely agree. And in fact, you can look at an example, in another country that's playing out right now, and that's in Argentina. So Milei has done some good things in terms of trying to get a handle over, Argentina's state and its, sort of chaotic, hyperinflation and other problems. And but doing so has meant that there are some problems in the bond market and some other things that are generating a certain amount of friction. So now Milei has had to have a bailout from the United States, and even with that bailout, he's still facing a lot of headwinds in the forthcoming parliamentary elections. So Milei is doing a lot of the right things. I'm not saying that he's a perfect sort of Rothbardian philosopher king or something. But in general, I think he's the kind of reformer you need in many places in Latin America, including in Argentina. And yet, he's been doing a lot of the right things, but he's probably going to get punished very hard for doing them, as he gets towards this election. And with the Republican Party, I completely agree. There is a very great reluctance, and this isn't even deeply ideological, it's almost superstitious, but there's a great reluctance on the part of a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives, a lot of people who want the Trump administration to succeed. There's a reluctance to acknowledge that there's still a lot of things in our economy right now, a lot of prices in the supermarket that look really bad to just ordinary Americans who are buying their groceries. And if you aren't thinking about that and aren't thinking about when is that going to get resolved, how is that going to shake out, you're going to have not only a terrible midterm next year, but also you'll have very bad results in 2028. So I worry about that a lot. And again, it's some of it is not just that we're fooling around and doing silly things against Venezuela and trying to create regime change in Venezuela now kind of on the cheap. That's bad in its own right. That's not necessarily causing problems for the prices in the supermarket. But in general, there's a bit of neglect. There's a sense, I think, kind of riffing off what you had said a few minutes ago. It's not just that there is a sense that the enemy is vanquished, the Democrats are vanquished, but rather that the problems that led to the Democrats' defeat, because they did lead to defeat for the Democrats last year in 2024, that means that somehow those problems are solved, right? Because those problems were all caused by Democrats being in office. Democrats aren't in office now. Hey, ipso facto, there can't be inflation anymore. There can't be any of these other problems. Whereas, in fact, that's not the truth. Now, I will say that, obviously Trump has been extremely bold and daring with his tariff policy. That's caused a lot of changes in the economy. In some cases, you have, prices that have definitely gone up. In other cases, you have prices that have not gone up or that have, kind of surprised economists by how moderate they've been. So Trump is certainly playing in a very high stakes game with all of that. I am someone who's generally favorable towards measures of protectionism. But what Trump's doing is, more high risk than I would have, personally been in favor of. That said, Trump is someone who has kind of led his whole life with, playing high risk games and ultimately winning. So, I'm somewhat hopeful, but at the same time, I think there has to be, in addition to a bold and very enterprising side of, MAGA and the Trump movement, there also have to be some people saying, you know what, just look at the fundamentals, be careful about the basics here, and certainly, make sure that ordinary Americans feel as if they can feed their families and have a positive outlook on the economy.
Hey everyone, this open enrollment, don't make the same mistakes again, agreeing to overpriced premiums and fine print that generates unpleasant surprises at all the wrong times. The Woods family doesn't play that game anymore. Affordable Care Act, don't make me laugh. We ditched the old-fashioned way and embraced crowd health, the alternative to the crazy American health insurance world. Otherwise, you sit there watching your premiums keep going up, you wonder what you're even paying for half the time, and the processes are opaque and you have to hire a private detective to figure things out. If that doesn't sound appealing, and it doesn't, then welcome to Crowd Health, the health insurance alternative. We're talking health care for under $100. You get access to a team of health bill negotiators, low-cost prescription and lab testing tools, as well as a database of low-cost, high-quality doctors vetted by Crowd Health. And if something major happens, you pay the first $500, then the crowd steps in to help fund the rest. If this all sounds familiar, it's a little like the options we used to have before Obamacare messed everything up. And of course, you'll join the crowd, a group of members just like you who want to help pay for each other's unexpected medical events. The system is betting you'll stay stuck in the same overpriced, overcomplicated mess. And this year, it's even more complicated because most of the Affordable Care Act subsidies expire, which means your prices are going sky high. This open enrollment, take your power back. Join Crowd Health to get started today for $99 per month for your first 3 months using code WOODS at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, code WOODS. Crowd Health is not insurance. Opt out. Take your power back. This is how we win. Joincrowdhealth.com, code WOODS. Well, let's talk about another issue. Now, I don't know how many people are single-issue voters on it, but maybe more than we think. And that's the Middle East and Israel and Zionism, issues like that. Now, in particular, the younger people, as we all know from the polls, are drifting away from Israel in terms of their support. And now, first of all, the younger people are also the ones least likely to vote. I mean, overwhelmingly, every candidate who has said, I'm going to, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Ron Paul or whoever it is, that I'm going to be swept into office by, or maybe even Howard Dean. I don't know if he was making a special appeal to the young or not. I'm going to be swept into office by the young. It doesn't quite happen. Now, in Bernie's case, there were also some shenanigans behind closed doors, I'm sure, that didn't help either. But obviously now we do have this peace plan, and there is some skepticism on the side of people who are not big friends of Israel, that Israel will actually stick to it, that once they get their hostages back, they're just going to go right back and start the war again. Well, that remains to be seen. But I think a lot of people perceive Trump as having hitched his wagon so much to Israel that it maybe undermines some of his appeal that he might have had with the young. And then likewise, apparently he posted a video on TikTok telling the young people, you should thank me because I saved TikTok. And apparently the comments thread was all release the Epstein files. So, so these are issues these are problems that he has to deal with somehow.
Well, they are. When it comes to Israel, though, how do you think that people who are unhappy with Trump being too pro-Israel, who are they going to vote for in 2028? Because I don't see the Democrats nominating in 2028, just as they didn't in 2024, nominating or even giving consideration to someone who takes a very strong anti-Israel line. And that's partly, for these generational reasons. This is the party of Chuck Schumer. It's the party of, folks who, in fact, if you look at what happened in Democratic primaries in 2024, the critics of Israel got slaughtered, and, very strongly pro-Israel replacements won in most of those primaries. And these are Democratic primaries in a presidential year. So we're talking about as much engagement as you can possibly get in, the political process. This was not, a matter of young people just overlooking the fact there was an election. This is as galvanizing as things can get. And yet when those forces were directly put into opposition to one another, pro-Israel and anti-Israel elements in the Democratic Party, the pro-Israel elements won. And I very much expect that will be the case again in 2028. So, and for that matter, in next year's midterms. So people who are, think that nothing good can happen until the United States, I have to say, I'm not sure exactly where some of these folks are coming from, because, a completely reasonable libertarian view here, and it's certainly the view that Thomas Massey has, we should not be giving foreign aid to anyone. We should cut off, funding for war in Ukraine. We should cut off NATO, and we should cut off Israel. We should cut off all of that. So that's a consistent view that says the U.S. just should not be acting as the paymaster for all of these different conflicts. And there certainly are young people who do have that point of view, but there are also young people who seem to only prioritize Israel in looking at these questions. And I think, certainly on the left, there are people who go way beyond that. And, they're not just saying that we shouldn't be giving Israel arms and aid. They're saying that basically, well, the Palestinians are, that Hamas even is the victim here, and that, they're actually on the other side. And frankly, seeing the way that this debate has played out among young people, both in the in social media, but also on the streets of America, on the streets of our cities, and on the on our campuses, it really makes me reflect on the fact that it was a horrible mistake that we were ever involved in Vietnam in the first place, and the sooner we could have gotten out of Vietnam, the better. And yet, I realize now that certain people on the right who said back then that a lot of these left-wing anti-Vietnam War protesters, they weren't actually anti-war at all. They were just for the other side, and it was seeing America defeated that was their main priority, and not simply seeing America get out of a conflict that it was losing. So anyway, I'm skeptical that some of this ferment among young people is going to have consequences in the near future. Now, it will have consequences further down the line, and clearly, there's a much more skeptical attitude, in some cases a hostile attitude, but in other cases just a skeptical, I'm not buying the propaganda anymore kind of attitude on the young right especially. And, the kinds of things that, made the religious right of an earlier generation reflexively and in some cases, very deferentially pro-Israel, those former, kind of ideological structures are gone now, or at least are severely weakened. I don't think that Generation Z is ever going to look at Israel through the lenses that the boomers and other generations have. So if Israel wants to make a case to younger Americans, they're going to have to find a new way to do it. And in the absence of that, you will ultimately, over the course of 20 or 30 years, see America start to be less engaged in the Middle East and certainly be less, directly involved in giving arms and money to Israel. So I do think there's a change coming, but I'm skeptical that there's anything that's going to happen in the near future, except that you're going to see more tension within each of the parties. So it's not going to be that one party will be pro-Israel and the other will be anti explicitly. It's rather that you're going to have pro and Israel factions within both parties really being fighting a civil war in each party. And in the Democrats, I think the Democrats are going to have the far worse civil war because, again, there you have people who are not just critical of the fact that we are deeply involved in supporting the state of Israel, but rather they don't think the state of Israel should exist at all, just as they don't think America should exist at all, just as they think Columbus is bad. Their view of anti-colonialism extends to saying, well, look, America's a colonial state, Israel's a colonial state, even European countries have benefited from colonialism. And really what we need to see is a total victory of third world forces and anti-Western forces all around the world. There are actual, people who really believe that. And of course, they would be very surprised at what they'll get, if ever they see the triumph of these, sort of non-Western forces that they love, because, they'll be some of the first people put up against the wall. But there really are people who are stupid enough they believe this. They have this death wish, directed against Western civilization, even though it's the civilization that's made their lives possible. So I think you're going to see some very, bitter conflicts among Democrats. You already did in 2024, where the pro-Israel side absolutely won easily. But you're going to see it, continuing because the anti-Israel side is not defeated. They will keep coming back, and eventually they'll start winning some victories, and you'll have, even with someone like Mamdani, who's, a Muslim running for mayor of New York as a Democratic nominee, you saw how reluctant certain people in the Democratic establishment were to endorse Mamdani. And typically, this was framed as, well, we think Mamdani is a bit too much of a socialist, even for Democrats. We think he's, economically maybe not all that great. And, maybe he's said a lot of things, denigrating police officers and generally, living down to the worst caricature of certain elements of the left. So some of the Democratic establishment was skeptical of Mamdani for those reasons. But I think there are others who also look at Mamdani and look at what he might imply, for the Democratic Party's support for Israel. And they have grave, reservations and a certain amount of hostility towards Mamdani for that. So that's how I read this issue playing out politically, at least.
I don't want to wait to the very end of the episode when people might be switching it off to say something about your podcast. So let's say that now and then continue the conversation.
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, I am the editor of a publication called Modern Age, which was founded by Russell Kirk all the way back in 1957, and it's still in print today as a quarterly publication. We also revamped our website. We now have every weekday a new article or a top-notch article from our archives presented each day, each weekday at modernagejournal.com. But now we have this third element to Modern Age. So in addition to the print magazine and the website, we've started a weekly podcast, which is basically a monologue from yours truly. And so I've been doing that for the past 2 or 3 months. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on a number of other outlets for podcasts. And it's just called Modern Age with Dan McCarthy.
It's great, by the way. And it's so far anyway, it's just Dan talking. And in my life, I need more of that. So I listen myself. I want to ask you something that I don't think we ever got to, because I don't think your appearances on the show overlapped with the big conversations about it. But this matter of Epstein, which is an area where Marjorie Taylor Greene has been at odds with the Trump White House. Obviously, there's something going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But the line seems to be that okay, look, everybody, you've way blown this out of proportion, and or I can't just release a list of names because not everybody on this list would be guilty of anything. And so we get things like that. The problem is somebody has to be honest enough to come out and say, if that's the line they're going to take, J.D. Vance was misled because he said there's a list and it needs to be released. Kash Patel was misled. Donald Trump Jr. was misled. Somebody just needs to come clean and say, sorry, I don't know how this happened, but we way exaggerated this whole thing, and now we have egg on our faces. But I don't see how you can simultaneously let those posts float out there with this is all a Democrat hoax. And yet somehow we're supposed to just we're supposed to inhabit a universe where both of these things are floating out there.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't think much of the just political arguments that are made in either direction. So clearly, each party at different times has used the Epstein, scandal as a way to advance itself. So before the re-election of Donald Trump, along with J.D. Vance, Republicans were saying, hey, you know what, this Epstein scandal is all about the Democrats. When we get into office, we're going to release the file. We're going to expose Bill Clinton and all of these, politicians and show how absolutely, corrupt and criminal these folks were. Now, of course, the shoe is on the other foot. The Republicans are saying, hey, too many innocent people would be harmed if we release the list. And the Democrats, and some elements of the independent elements of America First or of MAGA, and people like libertarians like Thomas Massey, people who are America First like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're also saying, well, wait a minute, you have to release the list. You said that it was something you would do if you got elected, if you got put into office, and what happened to this argument? This was all about the Democrats. So you're exactly right about that. And yet it seems to me all of that is kind of overlooking what is, I think, probably the crux of the issue here, because I don't think there's any way on God's green earth that someone does the things that Epstein was doing, which was, hosting American presidents, hosting former Israeli prime ministers, hosting members of the British royal family on a private island where sexual shenanigans are going on with underage women, and where, there have been plenty of indications, plenty of we haven't been shown any tapes, but clearly Epstein was in a position to make videotapes, to have monitoring of what was going on in his premises. And I can think of a lot of reasons, blackmail being the obvious one, but frankly, if you're engaged in this kind of stuff and very powerful people are being compromised, you might not need just not only want blackmail material, but you might also want protection, because just you don't know what's going to happen. So, and by the way, I mean, speaking of protection, obviously not only do you have Epstein's suicide in prison, but of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's father dies under curious circumstances in the middle of the ocean, where he just, falls off his yacht and drowns. So, there are lots of things to be concerned about here. So you can't do the things with people of the stature that Epstein was interacting with without being on the radar, without being of keen interest to a very large number of intelligence agencies. The Israeli intelligence agencies are going to be keeping track of what's going on with Israeli politicians. The British have MI6 and other agencies keeping very close tabs on what the royal family is doing. They have to. And of course, Prince Andrew was much closer in the line of succession. He was number 2 or 3 at that time, back when he was cavorting with Epstein, than he is now. So Prince Andrew was not a marginal figure. Similarly, American intelligence, the CIA, is very keenly interested in what presidents and American politicians are doing. One of the things, by the way, I've always thought is interesting is, we hear these justifications offered for intelligence agencies. Well, they're not allowed to do domestic spying, right? So the CIA isn't supposed to be spying on American politicians and Americans in general. But of course, all of these intelligence agencies have relationships with one another. And what's domestic for one agency is foreign to another agency. So if MI6 is, keeping tabs on Bill Clinton's sex life, or if the Mossad is keeping tabs on some senator, and the CIA is interacting with MI6 and the Mossad, you kind of wonder what kinds of information exchanges are taking place here. And it seems to me that, all of these shadowy, somewhat extra constitutional entities are in a position to have, information that the public doesn't have, and that, even most politicians don't have. So they're in a position of, knowledge is power, and they have knowledge that other people don't, which means they have power that other people don't. So certainly, even in the most absolute, most, sort of benign and, harmless interpretation of everything, you could say, okay, Epstein was privately doing, wicked things on his island, but, but the only influence of anyone else, any outside agencies, would just have been monitoring what's going on, making sure that Prince Andrew isn't going to get kidnapped, making sure that, Bill Clinton isn't going to be blackmailed, etc. You could say that there's a purely defensive element here. But even if you're saying it's purely defensive, clearly these intelligence agencies would have been paying close attention to what was happening. So now that, of course, is an extremely naive and benign interpretation. The reality is, all of these intelligence agencies, especially since, common sense tells you, yes, there's video of what's going on here. This involves, activity with minors. This is stuff that can definitely be used for blackmail. All of these intelligence agencies see this as a resource they can use. This is not simply something they have to defend their own countrymen, their own politicians against. This is something that could conceivably be used very effectively to get other people in other countries to move in the direction they want to have them move. So I'm absolutely certain that there is, a very deep intelligence dimension to what was going on Epstein's Island. And again, you could have a benign interpretation of that, which would say this was just monitoring, this was just keeping tabs. You could have a much less benign interpretation, or several much less benign interpretations, which range from, hey, they were just monitoring, but they were going to use what they monitored for advantage, or for that matter, the whole, the island and Epstein himself could all have been somebody's op. And then the question is, well, who's op? What intelligence agency might have been behind this whole thing? And there's no answer to that question, which would not be a kind of globally significant scandal. I mean, it would be something that would consume, it would not only rock the foundations of the American security community, it would rock the foundations of, all of the security communities, all of these intelligence agencies in other countries as well. By the way, you're already seeing this. So Peter Mandelson, who was a former Tony Blair associate, who was made Keir Starmer's ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson recently had to resign as ambassador to the United States because he's mentioned in the Epstein files. And, he was not fully honest about his exposure with the Epstein problem. So Keir Starmer said, look, you have to step down. We can't have this on our consciences. So, this is an international scandal. It involves intelligence agencies. And I think, if you got the whole thing out in the public, this would lead to, just shockwaves that would be absolutely enormous. And it seems to me there are an awful lot of people who are not necessarily going to be, guilty of, statutory rape or abuse of minors, but who nonetheless are, close enough to the dirt and the filth here that they would be severely embarrassed and sort of, kind of sucked into the perimeter of the black hole here. I kind of suspect that, President Trump himself might be in that category. I don't think Trump, was likely to be, deeply involved in any kind of criminal activity. I think Democrats would have used that against him if he were. But I do think, he knew what Epstein was up to. And of course, he has public comments where he says, Epstein really likes them young. Well, I mean, that doesn't leave anything to the imagination. It's very clear what that's signifying. So, even people who might be on the periphery of the really horrible stuff, even they would be, their public image would be consumed by this. And of course, but something much more fundamental would be, sort of brought to light. And that is the involvement of intelligence agencies in some extremely nasty stuff, from basically human trafficking, sex trafficking, sexual exploitation of minors, blackmail of politicians. It would raise some very serious questions. By the way, this is not the only scandal of this sort which has happened. It's the most well known. But at some point, I'm going to write about Denny Hastert and his very strange career, and the sex scandals that ultimately he's known for. And basically, before Denny Hastert, while Denny Hastert was still Speaker of the House, I heard rumors from two different sources, which did not have any contact with one another, suggesting that Denny Hastert was leading a secret life. And I was inclined to dismiss both of those sources because I thought, if this is true, everybody would know about it. The Washington Post would be reporting on it. There's no way you could keep something like this secret. Well, of course, a year or two after Denny Hastert is no longer Speaker, we find out that there are these financial transactions where he's paying off a blackmailer. He's paying off a blackmailer who was basically, as a minor, was molested by Denny Hastert. This stuff was there were people who seemed to know something about Denny Hastert's life, which again, even these minor contacts that I had were telling me about. Not stuff that involved minors, but just basically that Denny Hastert had a very active kind of secret sex life. I think this stuff was more widely known among people with, political angles and professional angles, intelligence angles, all in play. So I think this goes to something much bigger, sort of behind the scenes of how government actually works behind the curtain. And it's, these intelligence agencies have means of manipulating things, which would be, again, a global scandal. So this is why I think, Trump is not going to release the Epstein files. I think it's less about, his own personal exposure than it is about, does he really want to, fire a bullet that's going to bring down, the entire elephant, not only of U.S. intelligence, but perhaps of global intelligence, other agencies and other places as well. That would be a huge move to make. And I think, even Trump, who's, accustomed to making some very dramatic moves, thinks that that's something that goes beyond battles that he wants to fight right now.
Hey everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you're a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. What if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking? Use your website as a lead generation engine. What if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO Expert Search Engine Optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, and I realize this is entirely juvenile, about possible scenarios as he leaves office. So if he leaves office and a Democrat wins, well, they're going to go after him no matter what he does. So I wonder if this is a bomb he would drop, or would he want to do that to a J.D. Vance just as he's leaving office and then out he goes? Probably neither one of those will happen.
No, neither one will happen. And, again, this is something that not only affects individuals, it not only affects political parties, it affects a major component of the state itself. And not just, in the United States, but I think in other countries as well. So, if you would have to be as radical as Ron Paul, you would have to want to, tear down the system completely in order to be willing to pull that trigger. And I don't think Trump is quite there. Trump's very radical. I like some of his radicalism, but I also don't think he's, quite prepared to kind of, create this international as well as very deep US. I mean, it'd be much bigger than Watergate. I mean, think about it. The crimes that are involved here, the amount of, corruption. By the way, I mean, Watergate itself is another. I mean, you and I, know this, but normal people don't know this. Watergate is another clear example of this. So first of all, why was there a burglary of the Watergate in the first place? Now, the Nixon plumbers, right? They go in and they burgle an office in the DNC. Now, the DNC is not actually running the presidential campaign that year. Burgling the DNC doesn't give you information that allows you to destroy your political opponent normally, right? The DNC does fundraising, it does some campaign stuff, but it's really kind of small potatoes.
And not to mention the other thing that's been said is Nixon had such an enormous lead. What need would he have had to do something so risky?
Exactly. So there's very little reward to be had from burgling the DNC relative to the risks that are being taken, which are, of course, very, very high and turn out to be disastrous for Nixon. So the first question is, why do we have the burglary of the Watergate at all? Now, some of the burglars themselves, including G. Gordon Liddy, they asked themselves this question many, many times. Of course, the guy who orders the burglary, as I understand it, is one of these, slimy characters who is retroactively represented as one of the heroes of Watergate, and that's John Dean. John Dean was a lawyer working for the Nixon administration and the Nixon re-election committee, and John Dean's the guy who actually gives the order. Now, Dean will say that he was getting orders from John Mitchell and from others. There's some very interesting stuff about John Dean and maybe his connection to the DNC. So one of the rumors that is out there is that actually this particular DNC office, and remember what the burglars are actually going for is the filing cabinet of one of the secretaries. They're not even going after the main guy's stuff. They're going after one of the secretaries' filing cabinets. There is a theory that what was in that cabinet was basically information about prostitutes and connecting political figures with prostitutes, actually connecting political figures in both political parties with prostitutes. And it turns out that and there had been a prostitution ring that had been busted in Washington, D.C. just a week or two before, or a little while before. And it turns out the madam of this prostitution ring had formerly been the roommate, and I don't know how to interpret roommate, but roommate was the official term, the roommate of the woman who was John Dean's wife. So you wonder here, right? And, Washington, D.C. is, sometimes it's called Hollywood for ugly people, right? Which is, these are ugly, neurotic people. People who work for the government, congressmen, these are not, these are people that when they were kids, their mother would have to tie a pork chop around their neck to get the dog to play with them, right? These are not, people who are the life of the party, so to speak. If they want to have a good time with members of the opposite sex or members of the same sex, that is certainly happening too. They might very well be paying for it. So, and if they're paying for it, whoever they're paying is certainly keeping records. And again, there are folks, both private political intelligence and law enforcement, that become aware of these things. So, and then of course, what is Watergate also about? Watergate is about a president being destroyed by a member of the deep state who was jilted. So Mark Felt, who is Deep Throat, who provides, directly just hands, information to Woodward and Bernstein, mostly Woodward. Mark Felt was in line to be successor to J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, it was a very desirable, position, because J. Edgar Hoover was basically an extra constitutional authority in America. He controlled a secret police force and he was untouchable, which is why Hoover, remains in office for so long. Hoover's in office for so long because he had FBI files on every member of Congress, every member of the executive branch. He had blackmail material on absolutely everybody. And of course, Hoover burns his files when he leaves. Hoover himself, of course, there are plenty of stories about his personal life and about the kind of, extortion that he might have been subject to if people had an intelligence agency keeping tabs on him. So, but basically, Hoover was in a position to blackmail the government and to blackmail anyone in government, which is why he was able to keep his job long after he was, qualified to have it, if he ever was. And that's why the FBI was so unaccountable for so long. Well, finally, when Hoover's dead, there's this chance to replace him. And the question is the person who replaces Hoover going to inherit the absolute omnipotence, the omniscience and the omnipotence that comes with it that J. Edgar Hoover had? And Mark Felt desperately wanted that power. That's what Mark Felt was motivated by. And Nixon basically helped to save our country by stopping that power from being, handed over to anyone. He hands it over to a successor, but it's a successor who's not going to do the kinds of things that Hoover was doing and the kinds of things that Mark Felt was going to do. We know that Mark Felt would have done these horrible acts of blackmail because, of course, he uses the information he does have access to, even in his, sort of second or third tier position, to destroy President Nixon in revenge for being passed over. So Watergate is really a scandal about, an unaccountable layer of intelligence destroying a president who was trying to rein in the abuses of the intelligence world. Now, of course, Nixon himself, in doing this, is also committing various abuses himself. He's trying to use the CIA against the FBI. So he's getting the CIA involved in domestic operations. in a way, I mean, we'll bracket the question of how involved the CIA was in other kinds of domestic operations. But all of this is just, Watergate is a much bigger scandal than people realize, and it's not about Richard Nixon. And then, just finally, I'll add, we've got these JFK files, right? And Trump has been gradually declassifying a number of JFK files. And I thought, what can there possibly be in the JFK files at this point that would be eye-opening or shocking? But in fact, one of the major claims of JFK conspiracy theorists and researchers, one of the major claims that they've had for decades now is now literally confirmed by the most recent release of JFK files. This is basically, I'm going to get the details wrong because I'm really not an expert on the JFK case, but basically maybe during the Church Commission, during one of these revisitations by Congress of the JFK files in the 1970s, there was a CIA guy assigned to supposedly help Congress investigate the files. And the so-called conspiracy theorists said all along, well, you know what? This guy they assigned is actually a disinformation expert. This was a guy who was involved in the cover-up way back, in the 60s to begin with. This is one of the, sort of nastiest people the CIA could have assigned. And the only reason they would have assigned him is so he could cover things up. And he was using a pseudonym, but it was the same guy. Well, this was the theory. And until just this year, there was no proof of it. Here we are, basically more than 60 years after the assassination of JFK. And this theory is now proved. The documents have been released. And yes, indeed, this guy was exactly who the conspiracy theorists said he was. So the CIA was covering things up in the 1970s. These things have been covered up until today. What were they covering up? That's a very big question. And I'm kind of less of a, I don't take the most melodramatic reading of the JFK assassination. I don't think he was killed by American intelligence. But I do think that American intelligence knew an awful lot about Lee Harvey Oswald and had contacts with him that they have not disclosed. And I think American intelligence was involved in a lot of domestic operations, a lot of dealings with the mob, for example, which we basically know a little bit about, but have never really been fully disclosed. And if the magnitude of it were more fully known, this again would be something that would tear down this, whole intelligence apparatus that was built. It started being built even before World War II, but certainly after World War II, it became, an unaccountable, fourth branch of government unto itself that, basically overshadows the free form of government that we're supposed to have.
One thing I got to ask you about that. I mean, I read some stuff about Watergate, and I remember reading Silent Coup. I think that John Dean may have been his book. But what reason would Nixon have had not to try to, even if he is going to be impeached no matter what he does, at least exonerate himself to some degree in the eyes of history by saying, this is what I am trying to prevent from happening? Why doesn't he come clean about any of this?
Well, keep in mind, the nature of our political system is, the media was obviously not going to give a fair hearing to Richard Nixon, no matter what he said. He could try to use the bully pulpit, but at this point, he's already been so badly damaged that, who's going to believe what he has to say? And he is thinking, the Republican Party is also thinking very concretely about, first of all, the midterms that are coming up in 1974, a couple of months after Nixon's resignation, and then beyond the midterms, the 1976 presidential election. So the political impetus for Nixon to just take the blame and sort of get off the stage is very, very substantial. And of course, by doing this, and it is interesting. I mean, I hesitate just a little bit because a friend of mine is a major Gerald Ford scholar and actually runs one of the foundations that is preserving Gerald Ford's memory. But it's interesting how Gerald Ford is kind of a bad penny who turns up at the most interesting times in all of these kinds of scandals. So of course, by making way for Gerald Ford, by resigning, Nixon is then in a position to be pardoned. And basically, it's a way for the Republican Party to take, Nixon should not. Nixon's calculation is: look, I could vindicate myself and spite everyone else, and do some damage to the system, and the system is evil, so it'd be a good thing for me to do some damage to it. But the other calculation is: if I play the game, and if I go along and at least let the Republican Party save face, and then the Republican Party is going to let government save face, I will get a pardon, and things will be relatively smoothed over in that way. Nixon chose the establishment path, and Nixon, of course, undergoes a little bit of a rehabilitation later in his life. But I think, first of all, Nixon, again, kind of like Trump, wasn't radical enough. He didn't want to tear down the whole system by pointing out what had happened. And then also he wanted to play ball and make sure he got that pardon from Gerald Ford.
Well, this has been this episode went down roads I was certainly not expecting, but that I'm glad we did. Tell people one more time, what's the name of your podcast, and is it just available on all the usual places?
It's available on all the usual places, including YouTube. It's called Modern Age with Dan McCarthy. And basically what I do is I talk about whatever I'm writing about in my syndicated column, but then I kind of go beyond that to talk about some of the philosophical questions that are behind the headlines of today.
All right, so I'll have that. Again, it's on any platform, but I'll still have it linked somewhere for your convenience at tomwoods.com/2700. And I presume at the New York Post, there's got to be an article archive for you there. Okay, I'll link to that.
There certainly is, yes. So you can find my syndicated column at the New York Post. It's also published by the Daily Signal and by Chronicles magazine. So you find archives there and in a number of other places as well. And you can also find my writing in the Spectator World, the U.S. edition of the great venerable Spectator magazine. And it's now fortnightly, by the way. It's coming out every 2 weeks.
Oh,
and so
okay.
I have a column, every 2 weeks, a new one, a fresh one in the Spectator, and then a separate column that I write for the Creator Syndicate, which you can find in New York Post and elsewhere.
Very quick. Do you ever say to yourself, I don't know what to write this week, or is it easy for you to come up with things?
No, I often have to think not only what do I want to write about, but also what works for the different publications. So, it always requires a bit of effort to, not only find a topic, but to find a topic that I have something to say about and that works for everyone else as well. So it's good to have a number of different outlets. And, you'll find that my Spectator column and my syndicated column sometimes have slightly different approaches in terms of, even just the format of the column, but certainly in terms of, kind of with the Spectator, they're willing to indulge me in, sort of big picture questions. With the syndicated column, it's in daily newspapers, so they like to have things that really are on the immediate news of the day and that are as timely as possible and that are arguing something very specific about what should or should not happen at a given point. Whereas with the Spectator, I'm able to step back a little bit and say, hey, I'm not going to tell you exactly what policy I think should be adopted, but I'm going to present the big picture of what these problems are and how they fit together.
Makes sense. Well, I'll have Dan McCarthy links available at tomwoods.com/2700. Dan, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to join me on the best vacation ever. Check it out at tomwoodscruise.com. We'll see you next time.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.